The sound of pills rattling in the garbage disposal still haunts me. My own sister, Madison, stood in our Chicago apartment kitchen with her arms crossed, watching 30 days' worth of my prescribed medication disappear down the drain. "You don't need chemicals to fix what's broken in your head, Vivian," she said, her voice cold as January wind off Lake Michigan. "You need backbone." 6 months later, she was the one calling 911 while I lay unconscious in our shared bathroom, an empty bottle of sleeping pills beside me. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Growing up in Oak Park, Madison and I were inseparable. She was the older sister by 3 years, the one who taught me how to ride a bike, who braided my hair for school pictures, who stood up to bullies in 7th grade when they called me weird for spending lunch periods in the library. Back then, Madison Garcia Cooper was my hero. Our parents, Maria and Robert Cooper, divorced when I was 14 and Madison was 17. The split wasn't messy in the traditional sense, no screaming matches or thrown dishes, but it carved something permanent between us all. Dad moved to Portland for his job at Nike, and Mom threw herself into her real estate career, working 60-hour weeks to prove she could manage alone. Madison stepped into the role of surrogate parent, making sure I did homework, got to school on time, ate actual meals instead of cereal for dinner. Madison thrived in that responsibility. She was naturally organized, naturally confident, naturally everything I wasn't. While I struggled with anxiety that made my hands shake during presentations and kept me awake at night worrying about things that might never happen, Madison powered through her senior year, got accepted to Northwestern on a partial scholarship, and seemed to have life figured out by age 18. I, on the other hand, barely graduated high school. The panic attacks started junior year. At first, they were just moments of feeling overwhelmed in crowded hallways or during tests, but they escalated into full-body experiences. Heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst, sweating through clothes, feeling like I was drowning in air. The school counselor, Mrs. Patterson, suggested I see someone. Mom was too busy with work to really understand what was happening, and Dad was 1,000 miles away dealing with his own new life. Madison was the one who drove me to my first therapy appointment with Dr. Elizabeth Hendricks. She sat in the waiting room for the full hour, reading psychology textbooks she'd borrowed from the library. When I emerged, red-eyed and exhausted from talking about feelings I'd kept buried for months, Madison squeezed my shoulder and said, "We'll figure this out together." For a while, therapy helped. Dr. Hendricks was patient, kind, and never made me feel broken. She taught me breathing exercises, helped me identify triggers, and gradually I learned to navigate the world without feeling like I was constantly walking on thin ice. Madison would check in after each session, wanting to know what I'd learned, how I was feeling, whether I was getting better. But college changed Madison. Northwestern's business program was competitive, demanding, and she threw herself into it with the same intensity she'd brought to taking care of me. She joined 3 different business organizations, maintained a 3.8 GPA, and landed a coveted internship at a consulting firm downtown. When she talked about her classmates or professors, there was a new edge to her voice, a dismissiveness toward anything she perceived as weakness or excuse-making. "Everyone's got problems, Vivian," she'd say when I mentioned having a particularly difficult day. "The difference is some people push through and some people make it their identity." After graduating summa cum laude, Madison got hired full-time at Reynolds & Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious consulting firms. She was 22 and making more money than our mother. She moved into a sleek one-bedroom apartment in River North, bought expensive suits, and seemed to embody everything our culture says success should look like. Meanwhile, I was struggling through community college, taking classes part-time because full-time felt overwhelming. I'd tried several different majors, psychology, English, art therapy, but nothing stuck. The anxiety that I'd learned to manage in high school came back with a vengeance in college. Larger classes, more pressure, less structure, and the constant weight of feeling like I was disappointing everyone who expected me to have my life together by now. When I was 21, Dr. Hendricks suggested medication. It's not a cure-all, she explained, but for many people with anxiety and depression, the right medication can provide a foundation that makes therapy more effective and daily life more manageable. I was terrified. The stigma around mental health medication felt enormous, especially coming from a family that prized self-reliance and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. But the anxiety had gotten bad enough that some days I couldn't leave the apartment. Some weeks I'd miss all my classes because the thought of walking into a room full of people made my chest tight and my breathing shallow. Dr. Hendricks prescribed Zoloft, starting with a low dose. She explained it would take several weeks to build up in my system, that there might be side effects initially, and that finding the right medication often involved some trial and adjustment. I filled the prescription at the Walgreens near campus, staring at the little orange bottle like it contained either salvation or surrender. The first few weeks were rough, nausea, headaches, feeling disconnected from my own thoughts. But gradually, something shifted. The constant background noise of worry didn't disappear, but it got quieter. I could sit in a classroom without spending the entire time calculating exit routes. I could have conversations without rehearsing every word before speaking. For the first time in months, I slept through the night without waking up in a panic about things I couldn't control. Madison noticed the change when she visited for Thanksgiving. I was calmer, more present, actually engaging in family conversations instead of sitting quietly at the edge of them. Mom commented that I seemed more like myself, whatever that meant. But Madison's reaction was different. She pulled me aside while we were doing dishes and asked point blank if I was taking something. When I explained about the medication, her expression hardened in a way I'd never seen before. "You're medicating yourself into being a different person," she said. "That's not healing, Vivian. That's avoidance." I tried to explain what Dr. Hendricks had told me about chemical imbalances, about how medication could provide stability that made other coping strategies more effective. But Madison had already made up her mind. "I've watched people at work use antidepressants as an excuse to not push themselves. They take a pill instead of doing the hard work of actually changing their circumstances." She dried her hands on the dish towel and looked at me with something that felt like disappointment. "I thought you were stronger than that." That conversation planted a seed of doubt that grew over the following months. Madison would make little comments about people who needed chemicals to function normally, about the over-medication of America, about how previous generations had dealt with hardship without pharmaceutical assistance. She'd send me articles about meditation and exercise as alternatives to medication, always with messages like, "Thought you might find this interesting," or "something to consider." When Mom lost her job in February and couldn't afford to keep paying my rent, Madison offered to let me move in with her. Her River North apartment had a small den that could work as a bedroom, and she said it would be good for both of us. She could save money on her mortgage, and I could save money on rent while finishing school. It seemed like a generous offer from a sister who wanted to help. I had no idea it was the beginning of the worst period of my life. Moving in with Madison felt like stepping into a showroom. Her apartment was all clean lines and neutral colors, gray sectional, white walls, glass coffee table that never had so much as a water ring on it. The den she'd converted into my bedroom barely fit a twin bed and small dresser, but it was free, and after months of financial stress, free felt like a luxury. The rules started immediately. Madison had systems for everything: designated nights for grocery shopping, specific times for laundry, a cleaning schedule posted on the refrigerator like we were roommates in a college dorm. She explained it was about maximizing efficiency and maintaining standards. I figured she'd learned this kind of organization from her high-pressure job and went along with it. What I didn't anticipate was how closely she'd monitor my daily routine. Madison left for work at 6:30 a.m. sharp, always in perfectly pressed suits with her hair pulled back in a sleek bun. She'd return around 7 p.m., sometimes later if she had client dinners or networking events. But she seemed to have an uncanny ability to know exactly what I'd done during the day. Had I gone to class? Had I left the apartment at all? Had I done anything productive? "I'm just checking in," she'd say, but it felt more like surveillance. She'd notice if I'd moved things around, if I'd eaten food she hadn't specifically allocated to me, if I'd used her laptop while she was gone. The questions came wrapped in concern, but there was an undercurrent of judgment that made me feel like a teenager again. The medication issue came to a head 3 weeks after I moved in. I kept my Zoloft prescription in the bathroom medicine cabinet, taking it every morning as part of my routine. Madison had seen the bottle but hadn't commented, until one Tuesday evening when she cornered me in the kitchen. "How long are you planning to stay on those pills?" she asked, gesturing toward the bathroom. "Dr. Hendricks said it's not really about a timeline," I replied, pulling leftover pasta from the refrigerator. "It's about stability and managing symptoms." Madison leaned against the counter, arms crossed. She'd changed out of her work clothes into yoga pants and a Northwestern sweatshirt, but somehow still looked intimidating. "Vivian, you've been taking them for almost 2 years. Don't you think that's becoming a crutch?" A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The word crutch hit differently than her previous comments. It wasn't just skepticism, it was accusation. "They help me function," I said, heating up my food in the microwave. "Before the medication, I couldn't even sit through a full class without having panic attacks. And now you can barely get yourself to class at all." That stung because it was partially true. My attendance had been spotty, but not because of the medication. I was dealing with insomnia, probably from stress about money and living situation changes. Some mornings I'd oversleep, other days the thought of facing professors who knew I was behind on assignments felt overwhelming. "That's not related to Zoloft," I said. "Isn't it?" Madison pulled out her laptop and opened it on the kitchen island. "I've been reading about SSRIs and long-term dependency. Did you know they can actually make depression worse over time? That they can cause emotional blunting and reduce motivation?" She turned the screen toward me, showing a website I didn't recognize, with articles about the overprescription epidemic and natural alternatives to antidepressants. "Madison, these aren't medical journals," Dr. Hendricks explained. "Dr. Hendricks makes money from keeping you in therapy and on medication," Madison interrupted. "Of course she's not going to encourage you to get better on your own." The microwave beeped, and I pulled out my pasta, but suddenly I wasn't hungry anymore. "Look," Madison continued, her voice softening slightly, "I'm not trying to attack you. I love you, and I want what's best for you. But from where I sit, you're not getting better, you're getting dependent." She pulled up another article, this one about meditation and exercise as alternatives to pharmaceutical intervention. "My colleague Sarah dealt with anxiety through yoga and mindfulness. No medication, no side effects, no dependency issues. She's thriving now." Over the following days, Madison's campaign intensified. She'd leave printouts of articles on my bed, studies about meditation, success stories of people who'd weaned themselves off antidepressants, warnings about withdrawal symptoms that allegedly proved how addictive these medications were. She started suggesting activities we could do together: morning runs along the lakefront, yoga classes at her gym, meditation apps we could try. "I just want to see you succeed without relying on chemicals," she'd say. The pressure was constant but subtle. Madison never directly told me to stop taking the medication, but her disapproval was evident in every conversation about my mental health. When I had bad days, which still happened because medication isn't magic, she'd attribute it to being artificially dependent rather than acknowledging that anxiety and depression are ongoing conditions that require management. Her friends started weighing in too. During a dinner party at the apartment, I overheard Madison talking to her colleague Jennifer about enabling and how sometimes tough love was necessary to help people break patterns of learned helplessness. I realized they were talking about me. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning in April. I'd had a rough night.
One of those insomnia episodes where I'd laid awake until 3 a.m., worrying about everything and nothing. I'd finally fallen asleep around 4 a.m. and slept through my 8 a.m. class. When I shuffled to the bathroom around 10 a.m. to take my medication, the bottle wasn't there. I searched the entire medicine cabinet, then the bathroom counters, then my bedroom. Nothing. Madison had already left for work, so I texted her. Can't find my prescription. Did you see it anywhere? Her response came an hour later. Threw it out. We need to talk tonight. I stared at that text for 10 minutes, reading it over and over, trying to make it mean something different. She'd thrown away my medication. My sister, who claimed to love me, who said she wanted what was best for me, had literally thrown away prescribed medication that helped me function. I called Dr. Hendrick's office, but they couldn't fit me in until the following Tuesday. I called the pharmacy, but they couldn't refill the prescription early without doctor approval. I was stuck. That afternoon was horrible. Without the medication buffering my anxiety, every small thing felt enormous. The noise from construction outside the apartment was unbearable. The stack of assignments I was behind on looked insurmountable. The thought of confronting Madison when she got home made my hands shake. She arrived at 7:15, carrying Thai takeout and acting like nothing unusual had happened. "I got us pad Thai from that place you like," she said, unpacking containers on the kitchen island. "You threw away my medication." Madison paused at her unpacking but didn't look up. "I did." "That's not your decision to make. You're living in my apartment, and I won't enable destructive behavior." She finally met my eyes, and her expression was resolute. "You've been on those pills for 2 years, Vivian. You're not getting better. You're getting weaker." Weaker? The word came out like a whisper. Yes, weaker. You can't handle a full course load. You can't maintain relationships. You can't even get up in the morning without chemical assistance. That's not healing. That's dependency. She opened her takeout container and began eating as if we were discussing the weather. "Dr. Hendricks prescribed them for a reason," I said, my voice shaking. "Dr. Hendricks profits from your continued dependence. I don't." Madison took another bite of pad Thai. "I've watched you for 2 years make excuses instead of progress. Someone who actually loves you needs to intervene." The cruelty of it, the casual dismissal of my mental health needs disguised as love and concern, left me speechless. This was my sister, the person who'd braided my hair and stood up to bullies and held my hand during our parents' divorce. And she genuinely believed that throwing away my medication was an act of compassion. "I need those pills to function," I managed to say. Madison set down her fork and looked at me with what I can only describe as pity. "No, Vivian, you need them because you've convinced yourself you can't function without them. There's a difference." That night, lying in the narrow bed in her converted den, I realized something fundamental had shifted between us. Madison didn't see me as someone struggling with a medical condition that required treatment. She saw me as weak, as someone who'd chosen the easy way out, as someone who needed to be saved from my own perceived weakness. And she was going to save me whether I wanted to be saved or not. The withdrawal symptoms started within 48 hours. I'd never gone more than a day without my medication since starting it, so I had no idea what to expect. Dr. Hendricks had mentioned that stopping SSRIs abruptly could cause discontinuation syndrome, but she'd always talked about it in the context of a planned, gradual tapering process under medical supervision.
This wasn't gradual. This was cold turkey, courtesy of my sister's intervention. Friday morning, I woke up feeling like I had the flu. Nausea, dizziness, a strange tingling sensation in my hands and feet that I later learned was called brain zaps. But the physical symptoms were nothing compared to what happened to my emotional state. By Saturday, the anxiety had returned with a vengeance that made my pre-medication days look manageable. Every sound felt like it was being played through amplifiers. The texture of my clothes against my skin was irritating. Light seemed too bright, shadows too dark, everything too much. Madison, meanwhile, was treating this as a positive development. "Your body is detoxing," she explained when she found me curled up on the couch Saturday afternoon, trying to stop the room from spinning. It's like withdrawing from any other drug. It's going to be uncomfortable at first, but then you'll start feeling like yourself again. I feel like I'm dying, I whispered. That's the dependency talking. She sat on the coffee table facing me, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. This is exactly why I had to do this, Vivian. Look how much control those chemicals had over your system. She'd taken the weekend off work, something Madison never did, to support me through the transition. Her version of support involved forcing me to go on walks around the neighborhood when I could barely stand without feeling dizzy, making me elaborate meals I couldn't eat due to nausea, and providing a constant stream of encouragement that felt more like pressure. "You're stronger than you think," became her mantra. "You just have to push through this rough patch." Sunday was worse. The anxiety had evolved into something that felt like pure terror with no object. I wasn't afraid of anything specific. I was just afraid, constantly, with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. My heart raced for hours at a time. Sleep became impossible because every time I'd start to drift off, I'd jolt awake with the sensation that something terrible was about to happen. Madison found me sitting on the bathroom floor at 3 a.m., hyperventilating. Hey, she said, kneeling beside me. "You're okay. Just breathe." "I can't," I gasped. "Something's wrong, really wrong." "It's anxiety," Madison said firmly. "You've dealt with anxiety before. You know how to handle this." But this wasn't the anxiety I dealt with before. This was anxiety amplified by withdrawal, anxiety without any chemical buffer, anxiety that felt like it was literally going to kill me. "I need to go to the hospital," I said. "No, you don't." Madison's voice had an edge now. "You need to not give up at the first sign of discomfort. This is exactly what I'm talking about, Vivian. You want to run to medical intervention instead of dealing with your feelings." She helped me back to bed and sat with me until I eventually exhausted myself into a fitful sleep around 5 a.m. Monday, I was supposed to have my appointment with Dr. Hendricks, but Madison convinced me to cancel it. "Give this process a chance," she argued. "If you go running back to her the moment things get difficult, you'll never know if you could have handled it on your own." I was too sick and too mentally foggy to argue effectively. The withdrawal symptoms made it hard to think clearly, hard to advocate for myself, hard to trust my own judgment about what I needed. Tuesday was when Madison really ramped up the alternative interventions. She'd bought meditation cushions, aromatherapy oils, a collection of self-help books about natural healing and mind over matter. She'd signed us up for a yoga class, purchased supplements that were supposed to support neurotransmitter balance naturally, and downloaded guided meditation apps. "This is your opportunity," she said, arranging the new supplies in the living room like she was setting up a wellness retreat. "Instead of masking your problems with chemicals, you can actually heal them." The yoga class was a disaster. I made it through 20 minutes before having to leave the studio, overwhelmed by the heat, the proximity of other people, and a panic attack that made me feel like I was suffocating. Madison was mortified. "You didn't even try," she said in the car afterward. "I tried. I couldn't handle it." "Because you told yourself you couldn't handle it." She gripped the steering wheel tighter. "You've trained yourself to believe you're incapable of managing normal situations without medication. That's learned helplessness, Vivian." The supplements made me violently ill. The meditation apps felt impossible because sitting still with my thoughts for even 5 minutes was torture. The aromatherapy oils gave me headaches. Nothing Madison had researched as an alternative to medication was helping, but she attributed every failure to my lack of commitment rather than the possibility that I actually needed medical treatment. By Thursday, I hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night in a week. I'd lost 8 pounds because everything I ate made me nauseous. The brain zaps had evolved into constant dizziness that made it dangerous to walk up or down stairs. I was crying at random moments, not from sadness exactly, but from a kind of neurological overwhelm that felt completely beyond my control. But Madison was seeing progress. "You're more present," she told her friend Jennifer during a phone call I could overhear from my room. "Less foggy, more engaged. I think we're breaking through the artificial barrier those medications created." When Jennifer asked if maybe I should see a doctor about the withdrawal symptoms, Madison's response chilled me.
That's exactly what the pharmaceutical industry wants, people who panic the moment they try to get off their products. Vivian needs to learn that she's capable of handling difficult emotions without chemical assistance. Friday morning, I woke up and couldn't get out of bed. Not because I was tired, but because the effort of coordinating my body to sit up felt monumental. Everything hurt: muscles, joints, skin. Even my hair follicles seemed to ache. But more than the physical pain was a sense of despair so complete, it felt like drowning in black water. Madison came to check on me before work. "Still feeling rough?" she asked, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without crying. "It's going to get better," she said, smoothing my hair back like she used to when we were kids. "I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but you're doing something really brave. You're choosing to heal yourself instead of depending on artificial support." After she left for work, I lay in that bed, staring at the ceiling, and realized something that should have been obvious days earlier. Madison wasn't trying to help me get better. She was trying to prove a point about the superiority of willpower over medical treatment, and I was her test subject. She genuinely believed that forcing me through withdrawal would somehow cure my underlying anxiety and depression, as if mental illness was simply a matter of insufficient determination. She'd convinced herself that watching me suffer through symptoms that could be easily managed with proper medical care was an act of love.
But here's what Madison didn't understand about withdrawal from SSRIs, what her internet research and alternative wellness blogs had failed to mention. It doesn't cure the original condition, it just removes the treatment that was helping manage it. The anxiety and depression I'd been dealing with before medication hadn't disappeared, they'd been controlled. Now they were back in full force, amplified by the trauma of withdrawal and the betrayal of having my own sister sabotage my mental health care. That Friday afternoon, alone in Madison's pristine apartment while she was at work, I realized I had two choices. I could continue letting her experiment with my brain chemistry based on her philosophical objections to psychiatric medication, or I could take back control of my own mental health. I called Dr. Hendrix's office and made an appointment for Monday morning. I didn't tell Madison. The confrontation happened on Sunday evening, exactly 2 weeks after Madison had thrown away my medication. I'd managed to see Dr. Hendrix that Monday morning without Madison knowing. The appointment was devastating and validating in equal measure. Dr. Hendrix was horrified when I explained what had happened, both the abrupt discontinuation and Madison's reasoning behind it. "Vivian, this is medical abuse," she said, her usually calm demeanor cracking with anger. "No one, family member or otherwise, has the right to interfere with your prescribed treatment." She immediately wrote me a new prescription and explained that we'd need to restart the medication slowly to minimize side effects. She also gave me information about local support groups and suggested we increase our sessions temporarily to help me process the trauma of what Madison had put me through. "What your sister did wasn't love," Dr. Hendricks said as I was leaving. "Love supports your healing journey. It doesn't sabotage it." For the rest of that week, I'd been secretly taking my medication again, hiding the new prescription in my backpack and taking it in public restrooms or coffee shops when Madison wasn't around. The withdrawal symptoms were gradually subsiding, but I was living in constant fear of discovery. Madison had noticed the improvement in my condition, but she'd attributed it to her intervention finally working. "See," she'd said Thursday morning when I managed to eat a full breakfast without nausea, "your body is learning to regulate itself naturally again." I said nothing, but inside I was furious. She was taking credit for my recovery while having no idea that I was actually back on the medication she'd thrown away. The deception was eating at me, though. Living in her apartment while secretly going against her wishes felt unsustainable. I needed to either move out or have an honest conversation about boundaries and my right to make my own medical decisions. I chose confrontation. Sunday evening, Madison was in the kitchen preparing her weekly meal prep, perfectly portioned containers of grilled chicken, quinoa, and steamed vegetables lined up like soldiers. She was in a good mood, humming while she worked and occasionally commenting on how much progress I'd made over the past 2 weeks. "I've been thinking," she said, sealing another container, "maybe we should start planning some bigger challenges for you.
Now that you're handling day-to-day anxiety better, we could work on things like job interviews or dating. Really push your comfort zone. I was sitting at the kitchen island, watching her organize her life with the same precision she'd tried to apply to fixing mine. Madison, I need to tell you something. She looked up from her containers, immediately alert to the serious tone in my voice. I've been taking my medication again. The words hung in the air between us like a bomb that hadn't exploded yet. Madison's expression went through several rapid changes: confusion, then understanding, then something that looked like betrayal. What do you mean? I saw Dr. Hendricks on Monday. She gave me a new prescription. I've been taking it all week. Madison set down the container she'd been holding and turned to face me fully. You went behind my back? I went to my doctor for medical care. After everything we've been through? After all the progress you've made? Her voice was rising. You threw it all away the moment things got a little difficult? A little difficult? I stood up from the island stool. Madison, I was having withdrawal symptoms that made it dangerous for me to walk upstairs. I hadn't slept in a week. That wasn't progress. That was a medical crisis. It was detox. It was your body learning to function without artificial support. And you couldn't handle it, so you ran back to your drug dealer. My drug dealer? You mean my licensed psychiatrist? Madison stopped pacing and stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of disappointment and disgust that made my stomach clench. Do you hear yourself right now? You're defending your addiction to someone who profits from keeping you sick. I'm not addicted, Madison. I have a medical condition that responds to treatment. You have problems that you refuse to solve because taking a pill is easier than doing the hard work of actually changing your life. The accusation hit like a slap. This was my sister, the person who supposedly knew me better than anyone, reducing my mental health struggles to a character flaw. You don't understand what you're talking about, I said. I understand perfectly. Madison grabbed one of the articles she'd printed earlier in the week from a stack on the counter. I understand that psychiatric medications are overprescribed, that they create dependency, and that they prevent people from developing real coping skills. She thrust the paper toward me. It was from a website I didn't recognize, with a headline about Big Pharma's conspiracy to medicate normal human emotions. This isn't medical literature, I said. These are opinion pieces from people who aren't qualified to give medical advice.
And Dr. Hendricks is? Someone who makes money every time you walk through her door? She's a licensed professional with years of training in mental health treatment. Madison laughed, but there was no humor in it. She's a drug pusher with a diploma. She's convinced you that you can't function without her products, and now you're so dependent that you'll sneak around like an addict to get your fix. The word addict landed like a physical blow. I'd been called a lot of things in my life, but never that. Not by someone who claimed to love me. I'm not an addict, I said quietly. Really? Then stop taking the pills, right now. If you're not dependent, if you don't need them, just stop. That's not how medication works, Madison. You don't stop cancer treatment to prove you're not dependent on chemotherapy. Don't compare anxiety to cancer. Why not? They're both medical conditions that respond to treatment. Madison shook her head like I was a child who couldn't understand basic logic. Cancer is real. Anxiety is just feelings that you've convinced yourself you can't handle. There it was, the core of her belief system laid bare. Madison didn't think mental illness was real. She thought it was weakness disguised as medical necessity, and she thought helping me overcome it was a noble mission. You think I'm faking this, I said. I think you're catastrophizing normal human emotions because you've been taught that every uncomfortable feeling is a medical emergency. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and realized that the person standing in front of me wasn't Madison who'd braided my hair and protected me from bullies. This Madison saw my mental health struggles as a personal failing that reflected poorly on our family. She saw my medication as evidence of weakness that needed to be corrected. I'm moving out, I said. Madison's expression shifted to panic. Vivian, don't be dramatic. We can work through this. No, we can't.
You threw away my prescribed medication because you decided you know better than my doctor. You've spent 2 weeks experimenting with my brain chemistry based on articles you found on the internet. You just called me an addict for taking medication that helps me function. I was trying to help you get better. You were trying to prove that you're right about mental health treatment. I was just the test subject. Madison's face crumpled, and for a moment, she looked like the sister I remembered. I love you, she said. Everything I did was because I love you and I want you to be happy. I know you think that, I replied, but love doesn't sabotage someone's medical care. Love doesn't dismiss their pain as weakness. Love doesn't force them to suffer to prove a point. I walked toward my room to start packing. Where will you go? Madison called after me. I'll figure it out. You can't afford rent without me. You can't even handle a full course load. How are you going to manage living alone? I turned around in the doorway. Maybe I can't. Maybe I'll struggle. Maybe I'll need help. But at least it will be my choice to ask for that help, not someone else's choice to force it on me. That night, I called my mom for the first time in months and explained the situation. She was horrified by Madison's behavior and immediately offered to help me find a new place. She also apologized for not being more involved, for not recognizing how badly things had deteriorated between Madison and me. I thought she was taking care of you, Mom said. I didn't realize she was trying to control you. 2 days later, I moved into a studio apartment in Logan Square. It was tiny, expensive, and I could barely afford it, but it was mine. For the first time in months, I could take my medication without hiding, see my doctor without lying, and make decisions about my mental health without someone else's approval. Madison helped me move, but we barely spoke. As I loaded the last of my boxes into my mom's car, she stood in the doorway of her pristine apartment looking lost. I really thought I was helping, she said. I know, I replied. That's what made it so dangerous. Living alone should have been liberating, but the first month in my Logan Square studio was one of the hardest periods of my life. The apartment was a fourth-floor walk-up in a converted Victorian house. The radiator clanged all night, the neighbors upstairs practiced what sounded like tap dancing at 2 a.m., and the single window faced an alley that never got direct sunlight. But it was mine, and after months of living under Madison's surveillance, the privacy felt precious, even when everything else felt overwhelming.
The financial reality hit immediately. Between rent, utilities, groceries, and my medical expenses, I was spending more than I earned from my part-time job at a campus bookstore. I'd applied for financial aid, but there were complications with my enrollment status that meant I couldn't access student loans until the following semester. I was eating ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches, rationing my medication because I couldn't afford the copay every month, and walking 40 minutes to campus to save on bus fare. The stress was constant, but it was different from the stress of living with Madison. This was the stress of independence, difficult but not destructive. Madison and I didn't speak for 3 weeks after I moved out. She texted a few times, "How are you settling in?" and "Let me know if you need anything." But I wasn't ready for contact. I needed space to figure out who I was when I wasn't constantly defending my mental health choices or proving I wasn't weak. Dr. Hendricks helped me process the anger and betrayal I felt toward Madison. In our sessions, I began to understand how Madison's need to control my treatment had been about her own fears and insecurities rather than my actual well-being. People who've never experienced mental illness sometimes struggle to accept that it's a medical condition, Dr. Hendricks explained. They want to believe it's something that can be fixed through willpower because the alternative, that brain chemistry can malfunction just like any other organ system, feels too scary or unpredictable. I was making progress in therapy and adjusting well to being back on a consistent medication schedule. My anxiety was manageable, I was sleeping better, and I'd even started socializing with classmates for the first time in months. Life wasn't easy, but it was stable. Then Madison lost her job. The news came through my mom, who called on a Thursday evening in early June. Reynolds and Associates is downsizing, Mom explained. Madison was part of a big round of layoffs. She's devastated.
I felt a complicated mix of emotions, sympathy for Madison's situation, but also a petty satisfaction that her perfectly controlled life had hit an unexpected obstacle. Is she okay financially? I asked. She'll be fine short term, but you know Madison. Her identity is so tied up in being successful and having everything figured out. This is really shaking her. Mom paused, and I could tell she was building up to something. She's been asking about you. I think she wants to reach out, but she's embarrassed about how things ended between you two. I wasn't ready to deal with Madison's crisis on top of managing my own life, so I told Mom I'd think about contacting her, but didn't commit to anything. 2 days later, Madison texted me directly. "Can we talk? I know I messed up." I stared at that message for hours before responding. "I'm not ready yet." Her reply came immediately. "I understand. Just want you to know I've been doing a lot of thinking." Over the following week, Madison sent a series of texts that felt different from her previous communications. Instead of asking how I was doing or offering help, she was sharing what she'd been learning about mental health through her own research, real research this time, from medical journals and reputable sources. "Did you know that anxiety disorders affect 40 million adults in the US?" one text read. "I had no idea how common this was." Another, "Read an article about SSRI withdrawal. I'm so sorry I put you through that." I didn't respond to most of these messages, but I read them all. Madison seemed to be educating herself about the things she'd dismissed when I'd tried to explain them months earlier. 3 weeks after our first text exchange, she asked if she could take me to dinner. "Just to apologize properly," she wrote. "No agenda, no advice, just an apology." I agreed to meet her at a small Italian restaurant in Wicker Park, halfway between our apartments. Madison looked different when she walked in. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, she was wearing jeans instead of her typical business attire, and there were dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't been sleeping well. "Thank you for coming," she said, sliding into the booth across from me. "You look tired," I said. Madison laughed, but it was self-deprecating rather than dismissive. "Unemployment doesn't suit me. Turns out I don't handle uncertainty very well." We ordered food and made small talk about her job search and my summer classes. The conversation felt strained, but not hostile, which was progress from where we'd left things. Finally, Madison set down her fork and looked directly at me. "I owe you a massive apology," she said. "What I did to you was wrong on every level." I waited for her to continue. "I've been reading about mental health, about medication, about what withdrawal actually does to people. I also talked to a therapist, Dr. Susan Martinez, about my own control issues and why I felt the need to manage your medical care. This was not what I'd expected to hear." "You're seeing a therapist?" Madison nodded. "Losing my job made me realize how much of my identity was built on feeling like I had everything under control. When you were struggling with anxiety and depression, it scared me because I couldn't fix it. Instead of accepting that some things are beyond my ability to control, I convinced myself that you weren't really sick. You were just not trying hard enough." She paused to take a sip of water, and I noticed her hands were shaking slightly. "Dr. Martinez helped me understand that throwing away your medication wasn't about helping you. It was about proving to myself that I could solve problems that medical professionals couldn't solve. It was narcissistic and dangerous, and I'm horrified by what I put you through." I'd imagined this conversation many times over the past few months, but I'd never expected Madison to demonstrate this level of insight into her own behavior. "I appreciate the apology," I said carefully, "but understanding why you did it doesn't undo the damage." "I know," Madison said quickly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness or trying to fix our relationship right now. I just needed you to know that I finally understood how wrong I was." We finished dinner with Madison sharing what she'd learned about anxiety disorders and SSRI medications. She asked thoughtful questions about my treatment and listened without offering suggestions or alternatives. It was the first conversation we'd had about my mental health where she wasn't trying to manage or improve it. As we were leaving the restaurant, Madison hugged me goodbye. "I miss you," she said, "but I understand if you need more time before we can be close again." I miss you too, I admitted, but trust takes time to rebuild.
That dinner felt like a beginning. Not of our old relationship, but of something new and potentially healthier. Madison seemed to be genuinely working on understanding mental health and examining her own need to control other people's lives. For 2 weeks after that dinner, things felt hopeful. Madison would text occasionally with articles she'd found about mental health advocacy or updates on her therapy sessions. She was applying for jobs and seemed to be handling unemployment better than she had initially. Then something changed. The texts became more frequent and more urgent. Madison started calling late at night, sometimes crying, talking about feeling worthless and hopeless about her job prospects. She'd been unemployed for 6 weeks, and her savings were running low. "I don't know who I am if I'm not successful," she told me during one 1 a.m. phone call. Everything I thought I knew about myself was wrong. I tried to be supportive while maintaining boundaries. I suggested she talk to Dr. Martinez about these feelings, maybe consider medication if the depression was becoming severe. But Madison was resistant to the idea of psychiatric medication for herself, despite having learned to accept my need for it. "It's situational," she insisted. "Once I find a job, I'll feel better." But finding a job was proving more difficult than Madison had anticipated. The consulting market was tight, and her previous firm's mass layoffs and flooded the job market with experienced candidates. She was competing against people with similar credentials and longer track records. By mid-July, Madison's calls were coming every night. She was barely sleeping, barely eating, obsessing over job applications and interviews that weren't materializing into offers. Her therapist had suggested antidepressants, but Madison was still resistant. "I spent months telling you that medication was a weakness," she said during one particularly difficult phone call. "How can I take it myself now?" "Because you understand now that it's not a weakness," I replied. "It's a treatment." But Madison couldn't seem to make that leap for herself. She'd intellectually accepted that my medication was necessary, but she couldn't apply that same logic to her own situation. The last time I spoke to Madison was on a Tuesday night in late July. She called around 11 p.m., and I could tell immediately that something was different. Her voice was flat, emotionless, in a way that scared me. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you said in the restaurant, about trust taking time to rebuild." "Yeah? I don't think I deserve another chance. I don't think I deserve anything, really." That statement sent alarm bells through my mind. I'd learned enough about depression to recognize the warning signs of suicidal ideation. "Madison, that's not true. You made mistakes, but that doesn't make you worthless." "Doesn't it? I destroyed our relationship. I could have seriously hurt you with what I did. I'm unemployed, I'm broke, and I can't even follow my own advice about getting professional help." I stayed on the phone with her for 2 hours that night, trying to talk her through the crisis. I begged her to call Dr. Martinez, to go to the emergency room if she was having thoughts of hurting herself, to let me come over and stay with her. "I'm okay," she kept insisting. "I just needed to hear your voice." Before hanging up, she said something that should have been a clearer warning. "I'm glad we had dinner that night. I'm glad I got to apologize properly. It sounded like goodbye." I found Madison on Thursday morning. She hadn't answered her phone Wednesday, which wasn't unusual given her depression, but by Thursday afternoon, I had a growing sense that something was wrong. The last conversation we've had kept replaying in my mind, the flatness in her voice, the finality of her words, the way she'd said goodbye. I called Dr. Martinez's office and explained my concerns. She couldn't discuss Madison's case due to confidentiality, but she confirmed that Madison had missed her appointment that morning without calling to cancel. "If you're concerned about immediate safety," Dr. Martinez said carefully, "you should consider doing a wellness check." I took the train to River North and used the spare key Madison had given me months earlier when we'd still trusted each other completely. Her apartment was silent in a way that felt wrong. The blackout curtains were drawn, blocking out the afternoon sun, and the air felt stale, like it hadn't been circulating for days. I found her in her bedroom, unconscious on the bed she'd made with hospital corners every morning for as long as I'd known her. There was an empty bottle of sleeping pills on the nightstand next to a glass of water and a letter with my name written on the outside in Madison's precise handwriting. The next few hours passed in a blur of emergency responders, hospital hallways, and waiting room chairs that smelled like disinfectant and fear. Madison was alive, but barely. The EMT explained that we'd found her just in time. Another few hours, and the outcome would have been different. I called my mom from the hospital. Her breakdown over the phone was immediate and devastating. I should have known, she kept saying. I should have seen the signs. But the signs had been there. We'd all seen them. Madison had been depressed, isolated, expressing feelings of worthlessness and hopelessness. The difference was that none of us, including Madison herself, had taken her mental health crisis as seriously as we should have. Madison remained unconscious for 18 hours. When she finally woke up, groggy and confused from the medication they'd given her to counteract the overdose, the first person she asked for was me. I was sitting beside her hospital bed, reading a book I couldn't concentrate on when her eyes fluttered open. "Vivian?" Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "I'm here," I said, setting down the book and taking her hand. Madison looked around the hospital room slowly, taking in the IV line in her arm, the monitors beeping steadily beside her bed, the reality of where she was and why. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "Don't apologize," I said. "Just focus on getting better." The psychiatric evaluation team arrived later that afternoon. Madison was placed on a 72-hour hold for observation and evaluation. She was diagnosed with major depressive disorder and started on antidepressants, the same class of medication she'd thrown away from me 6 months earlier. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Dr. Sarah Chen, the psychiatrist assigned to Madison's case, explained that unemployment depression was a recognized condition, often triggered by the loss of identity and financial security that comes with job loss. Madison's case was complicated by her perfectionist tendencies and her difficulty accepting help or admitting vulnerability. "Your sister built her self-worth around being the person who fixes other people's problems," Dr. Chen told me during a family meeting. "When she couldn't fix her own problems, and when she realized she'd actually made yours worse, it created a cognitive dissonance that contributed to her depressive episode." Madison spent 5 days in the psychiatric ward. I visited every day, and we had conversations unlike any we'd ever had before. For the first time in our relationship, Madison was vulnerable and I was the stable one. The role reversal was strange, but healing for both of us. "I kept thinking about what I put you through," Madison said during one of our visits. "The withdrawal, the pain, the way I dismissed everything you were feeling. And then, when I was going through my own crisis, I couldn't even follow the advice I should have given you to get professional help and consider medication." She was sitting up in the hospital bed, wearing the standard-issue green scrubs that all psychiatric patients wore. Her hair was unwashed and her face was pale, but her eyes looked clearer than they had in weeks. "I finally understand what you meant about needing the medication to function," she continued. "They started me on Prozac yesterday, and I know it will take weeks to feel the full effect, but just knowing I'm getting treatment makes me feel less hopeless." "I'm proud of you for accepting help," I said. Madison laughed, but it was self-aware rather than bitter. "It only took a suicide attempt to get me there. Not exactly the efficient path I usually prefer." During her stay, Madison also participated in group therapy sessions with other patients dealing with depression and anxiety. Hearing other people's stories helped her understand that mental illness wasn't a character flaw or personal failing. It was a medical condition that can affect anyone, regardless of their intelligence, success, or strength. "There's a guy in my group who's a surgeon," she told me. "He's been dealing with depression for years, and he said the stigma in the medical profession made it even harder for him to seek treatment. Here's someone who saves lives every day, and he was ashamed to get help for his own brain chemistry." When Madison was discharged, she came to stay with me in my tiny Logan Square studio.
It was cramped and uncomfortable, but neither of us wanted her to be alone in her River North apartment where she'd attempted suicide. We slept on my narrow bed like we had as kids during thunderstorms, and talked late into the night about everything we'd been through. Madison apologized repeatedly for the way she treated my mental health struggles, and I found myself able to forgive her in a way I hadn't expected. "I think I needed to experience depression myself to really understand what you'd been dealing with," she said one night. "I'm horrified by that, but it's true."
You don't have to have experienced something personally to show compassion for it, I replied, but I'm glad you understand now. Madison started therapy with Dr. Martinez twice a week and attended a depression support group at the hospital where she'd been treated. She also began the difficult process of rebuilding her relationship with our mother, who was dealing with her own guilt about not recognizing how badly Madison was struggling. The job search continued, but Madison approached it differently now. Instead of treating unemployment as a personal failure, she understood it as a temporary situation that required patience and persistence. The antidepressants helped stabilize her mood, and therapy gave her tools for managing the stress and rejection that came with job hunting. 3 months after her suicide attempt, Madison got an offer from a smaller consulting firm that focused on nonprofit organizations. The salary was lower than her previous job, but the work felt more meaningful, and the company culture was less toxic than Reynolds and Associates had been. "It's funny," she said, as we celebrated her new job over dinner at the Italian restaurant where we'd had our reconciliation meal. "I thought losing my high-paying, high-pressure job was the worst thing that could happen to me, but it led me to therapy, to medication that I actually needed, and to a job that might actually make me happy." Madison moved back to her own apartment, but we stayed in close contact. Our relationship was different now, more honest, more equal, less based on her being the responsible older sister and me being the struggling younger one. We both had mental health conditions that required ongoing management, and we supported each other without trying to fix each other. 6 months after her suicide attempt, Madison started volunteering with a mental health advocacy organization, sharing her story to help reduce stigma around psychiatric medication and suicide prevention. She spoke at corporate wellness events about recognizing depression in high-achieving professionals who might not fit the typical image of someone struggling with mental illness. "I want people to understand that you can't think your way out of depression any more than you can think your way out of diabetes," she would tell audiences. "My sister tried to tell me that for years, but I had to learn it the hard way." The letter Madison had left for me the night of her suicide attempt remained unopened for months. When I finally read it, 6 months later, it was both heartbreaking and healing. She'd written about her regret for the way she'd treated my mental health struggles, her fears about being a burden on our family, and her hope that I would remember the good times we'd shared rather than the mistakes she'd made. But the last paragraph gave me hope. "If you're reading this, it means I wasn't strong enough to keep fighting, but you are strong enough. You've proven that by surviving everything I put you through and still finding the courage to get the help you needed. Take care of yourself, Vivian. Take your medication, see your therapist, and never let anyone, including me, tell you that seeking help is weakness. It's the strongest thing you can do." Today, Madison and I both take antidepressants. We both see therapists. We both have bad days and good days, and we've learned to support each other through both. The sister who once threw away my medication now texts me reminders to take my pills when I'm traveling. The person who called me weak for needing psychiatric treatment now advocates publicly for mental health awareness. Madison's suicide attempt changed both of our lives, but not in the way you might expect. It didn't cure our mental health conditions or erase the damage that had been done to our relationship. What it did was force us both to confront the reality that mental illness is serious, that treatment is necessary, and that love without understanding can be just as dangerous as no love at all. We learned that true strength isn't refusing help, it's having the courage to accept it. 2 years later, I stood in front of 200 people at Northwestern University's Mental Health Awareness Conference, looking out at an audience that included students, faculty, healthcare professionals, and family members of people struggling with mental illness. Madison sat in the third row, giving me an encouraging smile as I adjusted the microphone. My name is Vivian Cooper, and I want to tell you about the day my sister threw away my antidepressants, I began. The presentation was part of a speaker series Madison had helped organize through her work with the National Alliance on Mental Illness. After her recovery, she'd become deeply involved in advocacy work, using her business skills to coordinate awareness campaigns and fundraising events. But this was my first time speaking publicly about our story. I'd graduated from community college the previous spring with an associate degree in psychology. It had taken me 4 years to complete a 2-year program, but I'd finished with honors and had been accepted to transfer to DePaul University for my bachelor's degree. My goal was to become a licensed counselor, specializing in family therapy for people dealing with mental health crises. Mental illness doesn't just affect the person who has the diagnosis, I continued, my voice growing stronger as I found my rhythm. It affects entire family systems, and sometimes the people who love us most can inadvertently become obstacles to our healing. I talked about the difference between supporting someone's mental health journey and trying to control it. I explained how well-meaning family members could cause harm by dismissing medical treatment or pushing unproven alternatives. I shared the warning signs of suicidal ideation that we'd all missed or minimized with Madison. But mostly, I talked about recovery. Both individual recovery and family recovery. Healing isn't linear, I said, looking directly at Madison. It's not a problem you solve once and move on from. It's an ongoing process that requires patience, professional support, and the humility to admit when you don't have all the answers. After my presentation, dozens of people approached me with their own stories. A father whose son had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and was refusing medication. A woman whose sister was struggling with postpartum depression but wouldn't seek treatment. College students who were afraid to tell their families about their anxiety or depression because of stigma and misunderstanding. Madison joined me at the information table we'd set up, sharing resources and contact information for local mental health services. Watching her field questions from worried family members, I was struck by how completely her perspective had transformed. The most important thing you can do, she told a mother whose daughter had recently attempted suicide, is listen without trying to fix. Your daughter needs to know that you love her unconditionally, including the parts of her that are struggling. Treatment decisions should be made between her and her healthcare providers. Your job is to support whatever path leads to her wellness. This was the same person who 3 years earlier had believed that mental illness was a choice and that medication was weakness disguised as medical necessity. After the conference, Madison and I went to dinner at our usual Italian place, the same restaurant where we'd had our reconciliation meal and where we'd celebrated her new job. It had become our tradition to mark important milestones there. "I'm proud of you," Madison said as we settled into our familiar booth. "That presentation was incredible." I was terrified, I admitted. Public speaking still triggers my anxiety, even with medication. "But you did it anyway. That's courage." Madison had learned to distinguish between bravery and recklessness, between pushing through discomfort and ignoring legitimate medical needs. Her own experience with mental illness had given her a nuanced understanding of when encouragement was helpful and when it could be harmful. "How's the new group going?" I asked. Madison had recently started facilitating a support group for family members of people with mental illness. The group met weekly at the community center near her apartment and focused on helping loved ones understand their role in supporting recovery without becoming controlling or codependent. "It's challenging," she said. "A lot of parents and spouses come in with the same mindset I had. They think love means fixing, and they can't understand why their family member isn't getting better despite their efforts to help." She paused to take a sip of wine. "There's a dad in the group whose teenage son has severe anxiety. The dad keeps trying to force him into situations that trigger panic attacks because he thinks exposure will cure him. He can't understand that exposure therapy only works when it's done gradually, with professional guidance, and with the person's consent." "That sounds familiar," I said. Madison nodded ruefully. "I see myself in almost every family member who comes to the group. The desperation to help, the frustration when nothing you try works, the tendency to blame the mental health system or the person themselves when treatment doesn't produce immediate results." Her insight into family dynamics had made her an effective group facilitator, but it also meant she was constantly confronting reminders of her own past behavior. Do you ever regret getting involved in advocacy work? I asked. It must be emotionally draining to relive this stuff all the time. Madison considered the question seriously. Sometimes it's hard, she said, but I feel like I have a responsibility to use what I learned from my mistakes. If sharing our story prevents even one family from going through what we went through, it's worth it. She'd been promoted twice at the nonprofit consulting firm and was now leading their mental health initiative, helping other organizations develop employee wellness programs and mental health benefits. Her work had expanded beyond individual advocacy to systemic change. We're working with 3 major corporations to implement mental health first aid training for managers, she continued. The goal is to help supervisors recognize when employees might be struggling and know how to offer appropriate support without overstepping boundaries. Madison had found a way to channel her natural leadership abilities and desire to help people into work that actually made a positive difference. Instead of trying to control individual people's mental health decisions, she was working to change systems and policies that could support thousands of people's wellness. My own life had stabilized in ways I couldn't have imagined during those dark months of withdrawal and family conflict. I was maintaining a full course load at DePaul, working part-time at a crisis counseling hotline, and living in a shared apartment with 2 roommates who had become close friends. The crisis hotline work was emotionally challenging but deeply meaningful. I spent 4 hours every Saturday morning talking to people who were experiencing mental health crises, suicidal ideation, and family conflicts around mental illness. My own experiences with medication stigma and unsupportive family members helped me connect with callers who were dealing with similar situations. I had a call last week from a college student whose parents want her to stop taking antidepressants, I told Madison. They're threatening to cut off financial support if she doesn't try prayer and exercise instead. What did you tell her? I gave her information about campus counseling services and helped her develop a safety plan. But I also validated her feelings about her family's response. Sometimes people just need to hear that their family is wrong, that their mental health needs are valid, and that seeking treatment is a sign of strength. Madison reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'm sorry you had to experience that kind of invalidation to be able to help other people through it. I'm not sorry, I said, surprising myself with the honesty of that statement. I mean, I wish it had happened differently. I wish you'd been able to understand mental illness without having to experience it yourself. But everything we went through led us both to where we are now. Madison's therapy work had helped her process her guilt about the harm she'd caused, but she still struggled with self-forgiveness. Dr. Martinez had explained that this was common among people who'd caused trauma to family members before seeking treatment for their own mental health issues. The guilt serves a purpose, Madison had told me. It reminds me never to dismiss someone else's pain again. But Dr. Martinez says I need to find a balance between accountability and self-compassion. As we finished dinner, Madison pulled up her phone to show me something. I got a message today from someone who heard about our story through the NAMI newsletter, she said, opening her email. She said her brother had been refusing medication for his bipolar disorder, and their family had been enabling his decision because they thought respecting his autonomy meant not challenging his treatment choices. She scrolled down to find the relevant part of the message. But after reading about what happened with us, they realized that sometimes advocacy means encouraging people to seek appropriate medical care even when they're resistant. Her brother agreed to see a psychiatrist and is now stable on medication. Stories like this had become common since Madison and I had started sharing our experience publicly. We'd received messages from families who'd changed their approach to supporting their loved ones' mental health, from individuals who'd been inspired to seek treatment, and from healthcare providers who used our story to illustrate the importance of family education and support. Do you think we should write a book? Madison asked as we walked to the train station. It wasn't the first time she'd suggested this. Publishers had reached out after some of our speaking engagements, and our story had been featured in several mental health magazines and websites. Maybe, I said, but I want to finish my degree first, and I want to make sure we're doing it for the right reasons. What do you mean? I want to make sure we're sharing our story to help other people, not to make ourselves feel better about what happened. Madison nodded thoughtfully. Dr. Martinez says the same thing about my advocacy work. She wants me to regularly examine my motivations to make sure I'm not trying to earn redemption through good deeds. We hugged goodbye at the train platform, and I watched Madison disappear down the steps toward the Red Line. 3 years earlier, I never could have imagined that my sister, the person who dismissed my mental illness as weakness and thrown away my medication, would become one of the strongest advocates for mental health treatment I knew. But trauma and recovery have taught us both that people are capable of profound change when they're willing to confront their own limitations and seek help. As my train pulled into the station, I thought about the presentation I'd given that morning and the conversations I'd had with audience members afterward. Every person who'd approached me had been dealing with some version of the same struggle: how to love someone with mental illness without trying to control their healing process. There are no easy answers to that question, but our story has shown that the most dangerous kind of love is the kind that prioritizes being right over being helpful, that chooses judgment over compassion, and that mistakes control for care. Madison and I had both learned that true love, for others and for ourselves, sometimes means accepting that we don't have all the answers, that professional help is necessary, and that healing takes time. Most importantly, we'd learned that asking for help isn't a weakness, it's wisdom, and sometimes it's the difference between life and death. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.